Hi, everybody. Today is Tuesday, June 24th, 2025, and our friend Professor Marandi is back with us. Welcome back, Professor.
Hi, Nima. Thank you very much for inviting me.
I want to start with the ceasefire, something somehow surprising. And what has happened? Is there any ceasefire between Iran and Israel as we talk?
Well, my understanding, and it's still very early, and I heard it in the news like everyone else. Um, it seems that at this point, it is just a cessation of hostilities. There's no agreement on anything. And the Iranians have said that if the Israelis carry out strikes on Iran, we will renew the conflict and we will start firing missiles at the regime. Now, apparently, a missile struck Israel, the regime, after the ceasefire, and they dropped something on a field of, I don't know, grass or somewhere uh, symbolic. They didn't do anything in particular. I don't know if there will be an Iranian response or not because they didn't do anything. But the fact is that uh, the Israeli regime carried out a an act of war. They initiated war. It was a blitzkrieg. They murdered people as they were with friends and family. It was the night of Eid and celebration, and they destroyed some of the Iranian air defense systems and radars during the first few hours. And so, since a lot of the senior commanders, six, seven senior commanders, I don't remember the exact number, they were martyred. It took time for the Iranians to regroup. But after a few hours, Iran began to fire its missiles, and then it began to regroup and begin the fight. And progressively, things got worse for the regime. And that's why Netanyahu was basically begging for Trump to get involved, and Trump carried out his own act of war. Again, we have to remember that all of this was happening as Iran was negotiating. But Trump was lying. He was dishonest. He was deceitful. He was plotting against Iran as he was negotiating. And it now turns out that it's not just that he was plotting since almost possibly the beginning of the negotiations, but apparently this attack has been planned uh, from previous administrations for over a decade now. But I'm sure we'll get more information about that in the future. So the after the U.S. strike, which is a different issue, we can cover. Netanyahu continued to he began to beg for a ceasefire, and the Iranians continued it until this morning. And while Iran has been hurt, there's no doubt about that. After all, again, it was a sudden attack. It was a blitzkrieg attack like Nazi Germany. And some of Iran's important radar assets and uh, air defense assets were damaged and destroyed during those first hours. But Iran regrouped. It hit hard. It wasn't Iran that asked for a ceasefire. It was the Israeli regime. And Iran continued. And ultimately, during the last 2, 3 hours before the ceasefire or the cessation of hostilities took effect, the Iranians were hammering different parts of the Israeli regime from north to south to send a message that we can continue with this. I would say that this is a win for Iran. Now, it wasn't a decisive uh, defeat for the regime where it comes to the edge of collapse or anything like that. But it was a win for Iran, and the biggest loser of all, I think, is Netanyahu personally, because he uh, he showed that the Israeli regime is not invincible. This is the first time that the regime is being hit day and night, every single day, by missiles, heavy missiles. Iranian missiles are much more devastating than Israeli missiles. Israeli missiles have small warheads, they're fired from aircraft. The Iranian missiles have huge payloads. So every time an Iranian missile strikes, it causes enormous damage. And of course, the cost of the Israeli air defense system, as your viewers know, is enormous itself. So every time Iran fires a drone, and Iran has been firing hundreds, I think probably maybe 1,000 drones. I don't know. We'll have to see the numbers. They'll probably come out ultimately. And many of them have been hitting their targets, but they've not been the focus because the missiles have such more, they have much bigger impact. So the Israelis have been spending huge amounts of money to block drones and missiles. So even if they hit the drone, they're paying 15, 20 times as much as the Iranians have. In fact, many of these drones, not all, I don't know the percentage, but many of these drones and many of these missiles are very old. And so they were in stock, and the Iranians have been getting rid of them. Again, I'm not saying that the Iranians weren't hurt. The Israelis killed lots of people. They killed lots of women and children. Last night they bombed the hospital not far from here. I think I would say it's walk, an hour's distance walk. And they in outside of Tehran, they bombed a building in a city in the north, and they wiped out two families in that apartment building, in that building. And they've been hitting different areas. It's been largely targeting civilians, especially during the previous night. But throughout, no, throughout, it's mostly been civilians. In some cases, they struck uh, guard buildings that belong to the armed forces, but most of them were already empty. Uh, from day one, everything has been emptied. I remember when I was at Press TV during the interviews, during the first couple of days, they had evacuated everyone from the building. But as I was doing the interviews, there was always a couple of people in the building taking out all of the sensitive electronic equipment that's expensive. So that's what was happening across Tehran and elsewhere, and especially in key and sensitive sites. So most of the casualties as a result were civilian, and a lot of the government buildings or military buildings that were hit were largely empty. They murdered a senior government official who worked for the Ministry of Energy. She was the head of statistics for Iran's electrical power plants. They struck their building, again, a civilian, and murdered her. But that's just how the Israeli regime works. They don't care about people. They have no red lines. They don't consider non-Zionists to be human. We are all considered to be subhuman. And of course, the West is the same. Western elites consider us to be subhuman. That's why they support the Israelis throughout the genocide in Gaza, the Holocaust there, the genocidal strikes in Lebanon, and of course, the attacks on Iran. One advantage that this war had, although Iran's uh, nuclear infrastructure was damaged, no doubt about it. But first of all, Iran has many scientists. Um, Natanz is can easily be built. It's not that difficult. Bordeaux was never a priority for Iran. Natanz was never a priority because Bordeaux was well protected. We have to see how badly Bordeaux was damaged. But it is clear that Iran took out its key assets from all of these installations before they were struck. And in the case when the Americans struck, I think, and I don't know, I really don't know, I don't have inside information, but it seems that the Americans weren't told the Iranians beforehand, and the Iranians emptied many things, just like the Iranians warned beforehand when they struck Qatar and the American CENTCOM center there.
You mentioned the objectives of Israeli attack. You said that Iran won because of those objectives. One of the objectives was, I think, the main objective was to do so-called regime change in Iran. And how did that work for the Netanyahu administration, for Israelis who were somehow hoping by these people outside Iran, Iranian people who are participating, collaborating with them?
Well, yes, of course. The issue has never been the nuclear program. And I've said this many times before. It's never been human rights. It's never been animal rights. It's never been global warming. It's never been terrorism. and all the things that they use to sanction Iran and to harm Iran. That's not been the point. For 40 some years, the issue has been uh, regime change. It has been undermining Iran and the Islamic Republic of Iran, because Iran is fiercely independent, unlike other countries across the region. But in this case, just as important, Iran is the supporter of the Palestinian cause, and that is what makes the West so outraged and angry and intolerant of Iran. So that has always been the objective. And the Israeli regime miscalculated. We discussed this earlier. Iranian society has always viewed the Islamic Republic as legitimate, the legitimate state in Iran, whether the West likes it or not. People may be dissatisfied. Of course they are. They're always dissatisfied. Iranians in general, as you know, are people who, they are, we are usually dissatisfied. If we sit together among friends, we never say anything positive about a government, any government, or about the metro or the or airlines or anything or prices. That's just how we are. And of course, under sanctions, the maximum pressure sanctions that we've had for years, a part of Iran's sacrifice for being independent and supporting Palestine, it's been more difficult. But as I said, the legitimacy of the state in Iran is high. But what the Israelis actually did and what the Americans did is that they strengthened the state, because that segment of Iranian society that would consider itself to be Western oriented, or maybe they don't consider themselves to be Western oriented, but I would say they're Western oriented, especially among the middle class parts, large parts of the middle class, not all of them, large parts of them, and the upper middle class, not all of them, but again, a large segment of them. Their worldview has been devastated because they've seen the United States show deceit, and they've seen that Iran was negotiating, and then the Americans betrayed Iran and were deceitful and dishonest. And that wasn't just Trump. When he initiated the conflict against Iran or supported it, we saw the liberal media in the West support him. CNN and Fox News played the same role. Breitbart and the New York Times played the same role. One may use more bombastic language, and the other may be more, um, more a bit more, not very, but a bit more sophisticated in its propaganda. But young Iranians, educated Iranians who thought differently for whatever reason, uh, confronted reality. So I think the West has done itself a lot, has damaged itself among this class of Iranians. Also, I would say that this has created a permanent mistrust in Iran among the government and among elites towards the West. And it will quicken Iran's move towards the global South and towards BRICS and towards Asian powers to cooperate with them. It's going to make it much, much more difficult ever to work with Western countries anytime in the future, because the West supported the aggression. The Europeans supported airstrikes. And when Israel carried out an unprovoked assault, they called it an act of defense. So, you know, people in Iran, elites in Iran, see that. And also, one thing, Nima, one advantage that this has, it's war. A lot of damage was done, obviously. Although, again, Iranian missiles are much more devastating than the Israeli missiles. The Israeli missiles, their payload is much smaller. But one advantage that this has for the Iranian government as a card to play with is Iran's relationship with the International Atomic Energy Agency. In future, Iran is not going to give them that sort of access that they would have in the past, if any. And there's a debate in Iran about leaving the NPT, not producing a nuclear weapon, but just leaving so that the West would no longer know what's happening, so that the International Atomic Energy Agency would no longer pass on information to Israel to assassinate people, to bomb targets. So it's going to make, ironically, it's going to make things more difficult for the United States and the West.
You mean that Iran is concerned about the lives of its scientists? That's why they're not going to communicate the way that they did before, or it's only about the mistrust between the two parties?
Well, that the two are interrelated completely. Iran does not trust the International Atomic Energy Agency because Iran knows that they passed on information that led to the assassination of Iranian scientists. And Iran knows that it passes on information to the West and to the Israeli regime so that it can carry out attacks. And it knows that the International Atomic Energy Agency does not work with Iran in good faith, and that no matter what Iran does to prove that it's not pursuing nuclear weapons, the agency, since it's controlled by the West, and the board of directors has the majority of them of the members are in the Western camp, even though they are a small part of the international community. The Iranians know that working with them is next to to resolve issues. It's next to impossible. So this the relationship with the IAEA is going to change. What this war did, Nima, is that it united Iranian society in an unprecedented way since Saddam Hussein invaded. The only thing that I really, I'm just guessing, but from what I can see so far, the only segment of society that is dissatisfied now are those who said we should have continued the war. Everyone else says that Iran has every right to fight and that Iran is in the right and the West is aggressive and they murdered people and they're dishonest and deceitful and they don't work in good faith. That is the consensus now anyway. Those who are unhappy say we should have continued to hammer the Israeli regime, which is a legitimate argument. I'm not saying that they have no argument to make. However, I think I think the calculation in Iran is that they want to keep global public opinion, not just in the region, but across the globe, and meaning including governments, on their side. Because there has been a sea change in public opinion about Palestine, about Iran, about the resistance over the past 20, 21 months. But over the past 11, 12 days, it has increased this shift. And Russia, China, and the other BRICS nations have tilted closer to Iran, and Iran sees this as detrimental to the Israeli regime. And so, since Netanyahu was the side who was begging for a ceasefire, and the Iranians did not want to expand the war because it would create a global economic catastrophe, the Iranians calculated, rightly or wrongly, that now would be the time to end the war so that there would be less suffering among ordinary Iranians because the Israelis bomb ordinary people. Most of the people who died are ordinary people. And so that the global south will see Iran as the responsible actor and they'll continue to view the Israeli regime as the aggressor. Now, I think the most important thing that happens here is that Netanyahu is severely weak. And I think there will be implications the inside Israeli society. So he will, of course, try to spin it in a way to make it look as if he's won. But I think it's clear that Israel has shown itself no longer to be invincible. Iran every single day hammered the regime, and the final hours it was Iran that was hitting the regime left and right until the end, the cessation of hostilities. So that the Israeli regime has lost faith. It's lost. It's the image has been destroyed along with the West because of the genocide in Gaza and the genocidal attacks on Lebanon. And in the case of Iran, it was also seen as aggressive and attacking civilian nuclear uh, assets. The world condemned it. Forget the West. The world condemned it, but the majority. But but I think that in addition to all that, the Israeli regime has been seen as militarily very vulnerable. It could bomb Iran, and part of it was because, as I said, it was a sudden attack, and they took out some of Iran's air defense and uh, air air defense radar and air defense capabilities. But it was being hit very hard. And I think that that is something new for the regime, very new for the regime, unprecedented.
You mentioned the situation in Israel. I think the outcome of this conflict, this war between Iran and Israel, would bring huge repercussions within the society in Israel against Netanyahu. That would make the situation even more dangerous because when we see this ceasefire between Israel and Lebanon, many people are arguing may Israel may do the same with Iran. Do you, if Israel goes to the same direction as they did with Hezbollah, as they're doing right now with Hezbollah, with Lebanon, what would be the reaction from Iran?
Immediate retaliation. Anima, have no doubt, as we speak, the military is already preparing itself. As we speak, have no doubt that within days, within hours, within days, within weeks, they're going to be working day and night to fix their radar systems, to put new radar systems in place, to complete radar systems and surface to air missile systems that they were building because Iran builds both radar and surface to air missiles. It will be seeking, I'm sure, technology and capabilities from countries that are friendly, which I'm sure because of what happened over the last 11, 12 days, it's clear. I mean, it's clear that they tilted more towards Iran. All of that, I think, is very clear. So Iran is preparing itself. And no, if the Israelis do anything, Iran will go after them. And I don't want to go into detail, and I don't know everything, but there are certain things that Iran has to uh, fix. It has to take, learn from its experience over the last couple of weeks. And I think once they've uh, dealt with their deficiencies and they've dealt with their shortcomings, next time around, it will be a lot worse for the Israeli regime. Remember, Iran's, and this is something everyone has to keep in mind, Iran's underground bases, its underground missile and drone bases are untouched. Untouched. None of them, not a single one of them has been destroyed. Now, the problem that Iran has had was the Israelis were able to go and strike the entrance points of these bases, not destroy them. But then the Iranians would have to open, just like in what the Americans would do in Yemen, right? They'd strike the entry points of the bases, and then they'd have to reopen them again. So the Israelis were constantly doing that. But that is something that can be resolved. And again, this happened because of uh, the sudden nature of the attack. But there are ways in which Iran can be able to protect itself against Israeli regime aggression in the future and be much more effective in hitting back. So the advantage lies with Iran. And what Iran is betting on, again, I'm speculating here, but what Iran is betting on is that Netanyahu was begging for this ceasefire. And it came out that he was begging for this ceasefire. It came to the public, it became public knowledge before the actual ceasefire. And when Iran hammered the regime during the last couple of hours, uh, that hurt him. And I think what Iran is betting on is for Netanyahu, for this to create deeper divisions inside Israel. And for those divisions to become uh, critical and to push, and hopefully to push Israel towards some sort of internal crisis. But remember, Iran is not Hezbollah. Hezbollah is not the government in Lebanon. If Hezbollah was the government, it would be able to hit the Israelis back much harder. But Lebanon is a society where the Americans and Europeans have much influence, and they have many people on the payroll. And so, while the majority of Lebanese support Hezbollah, according to the recent elections and polls, but a strong minority is clearly in the American camp, and in a segment of that minority is in the Israeli camp, the fascists and like the people in the Lebanese forces. So, um, and they are, based on the constitution, they have disproportionate a disproportionate amount of power in Lebanon. And of course, you have all the Western embassies and NGOs. So Hezbollah is not Iran. It has to, it's not Yemen, where Yemen controls, Ansarullah and its allies control the government. Hezbollah doesn't have that status in Lebanon. If it did, it would be able to create much greater harm to the Israelis at much less cost. Sort of like in Gaza, even though Gaza is smaller, but since it's entirely controlled by the resistance, you know, stabbing it in the back, undermining it is much more difficult from the inside.
What Israeli Channel 12 reported that Iran has not used any of these cruise missiles, advanced cruise missiles during the fight. That shows that they didn't feel the necessity of using them. And do you think that if Israel starts again attacking Iran, that would come to the mind of the Iranian army to attack Israel with cruise missiles, or it's going to be off the table unless the United States tries to escalate the situation?
It's not just cruise missiles; it's also ballistic missiles. It's drones. Iran hasn't used a some of its key assets because it doesn't want the Israelis to know how to deal with them. So it has a diverse set of missiles and drones to use against the Israeli regime, and it tries not to use everything so that it can remain an unknown for future. And again, the vast majority of Iranian missiles have not been used; they've been untouched. Iran and for example, they spoke about destroying launchers. First of all, a lot of those images of launchers were just decoys and missiles. And you saw there was no secondary explosions. The same is true with radar and so on. But Iran has thousands of launchers. Iran doesn't, like the Israelis were saying they have 300 or something. They have thousands of launchers. Even if you look at just one or two of the bases when they're opened up, for when they were first opened up and we saw footage of them, we saw just from that footage in each case, tens, if not almost 100 launchers just in a single base in the parts that we saw. So Iran doesn't have a shortage of anything. What it has to do, I think, is that it has to uh, strengthen its air defense systems, strengthen its capabilities for drones, and that is more than doable because Iran has developed air defense systems itself. It has good technology and it has very good relations with countries that are very advanced in this regard. So I think it's going to be a top priority. The Israelis, you know, the Israelis are in trouble, and the Iranians, I think they came out on top. Again, the only segment of Iranian society that I've seen that is unhappy are those who said, "Let's keep fighting."
No.
But I think the argument in Iran goes that if we keep fighting, ultimately it's going to end with a ceasefire, and it's going to end with a crisis at home for Netanyahu, and it's going to end with more Iranians, civilians being killed. If Iran feels that it had the upper hand, despite the blitzkrieg, despite the betrayal of the regime in Washington, then why not have this ceasefire sooner rather than later? I would
When
understand if for example, if Iran had a ceasefire before, like on day 3 or day 4 or day 5, I would say no, that's not right, because the Israelis they still had the advantage, and the Iranians were regrouping, and they were beginning to they restored the balance, but they were still hurt from day one because what happened on day one. But now I think it would just be we would keep striking them, they would keep striking us, we would keep striking them. It would not be good for them, but at the end it would end in the ceasefire, and the same sort of situation that Netanyahu is going to be experiencing in the days and weeks ahead would be experienced with a greater delay. I think
what,
that's the calculation.
yeah, Donald Trump doesn't agree with some parts of the mainstream media that they're talking about that American attack on Iran was not successful the way that Donald Trump is trying to picture it. What has happened during the American attack in Iran? What is the picture? What is the evaluation, assessment, current assessment of the Iranian authorities?
I don't pretend to know because obviously that would be secret. The important one is Fordo. Uh, Esfahan is easily replaced. It's not something huge and it's not something difficult for Iran to do. Natanz was less well protected anyway, but Iran removed its assets from Natanz, and from what seems to be the case is that the United States informed Iran beforehand, and Iran removed assets from Fordo. So the most important thing about Fordo is A, the scientists, and overwhelmingly they're alive. A few scientists were murdered along with their families and neighbors and children and friends, but overwhelmingly they're alive. So they're the most important thing. The second most important thing is the equipment. Iran has that, and Iran what made Fordo and everything else. There are factories across the country that do that. So Iran has this broad infrastructure across the country. So this is not irreplaceable, and the assets apparently were moved. I don't know secrets. I don't know what happened in Fordo. I know that many Americans are now saying that there wasn't damage, and Trump is saying that it was totally destroyed. I don't know. I don't think it was totally destroyed, but it's based on the guess, and it's based on things that people have said to me who I'm not entirely sure they know. But there are people who are usually who don't talk nonsense in general, but that doesn't mean that they're right. So I don't know what happened in Fordo, but that there was without a doubt damage. There was damage to Iran's radars, there was damage to Iran's air defenses, there was damage to civil society, there was people killed, there was damage to people's homes, to hospitals, to the Red Crescent Society, and to the nuclear program. But a couple of things come out of this. One is that Iran has a stronger hand in dealing with the International Atomic Energy Agency because it betrayed Iran. And that strengthens Iran's nuclear program in its own way in the long run. Two, that segment of Iranian society that thought that the West was friendly and that the problem is ours, liberals, parts of the upper middle class, the upper class, their worldview has been shattered, and they see the West, the United States, for what it is, especially since it betrayed Iran at the negotiating table. The U.S. struck Iran right after Iran negotiated with the European three. So, with regards to public perceptions, things are not good for the West. And I think it's going to increase or strengthen the narrative in Iran, or the argument, I should say, the argument in Iran for improving relations with the global South. And I think the current administration, is also looking in that direction, that we should focus more on the global South rather than rapprochement with the West. So that these are serious things that will have an impact in the days ahead. Again, the dissatisfaction that exists is among those who say we should have continued. And I know some of Iran's supporters abroad are saying no, Iran should have done more. The government has to calculate a number of things. One is it has to calculate, is it worth having all these people killed? What do you get out of having more civilians murdered by the Israeli regime? Do you get more leverage? Is it going to change the situation in the Israeli regime? And two, Iran has to look in the long run that it wants to consolidate its position and the position of the resistance in the global South. Because in the long run, Israel is not going to be defeated by armed forces. It's not going to be overrun. That's never been the plan. The plan has always been to degrade it until it finally becomes unsustainable. That's how it's always been. There's never been anything other, and that is what the resistance has done in this 2021 months. They keep saying Hezbollah has been weakened. Hezbollah also weakened Israel. Hamas has been weakened. Hamas has weakened Israel. Islamic Jihad has been weakened. Islamic Jihad has weakened Israel. Ansarullah has weakened Israel, and Iran has more than anyone else weakened Israel. So Israel is much weaker than before. It is despised across the world, and that is going down the right path. But if Iran wants to, in the long run, outmaneuver the regime, to defeat the regime, it wants to have friends across the world. People, public opinion, which is now with Iran, people see Iran as the hope and the resistance as the hope. But also, Iran wants governments to be on its side because that strengthens the resistance. So Iran has to show the international community, the global South, that we're not just out there to kill, or we're not just out there to create some sort of regional war and economic crisis. We are the sane actors. We are the reasonable actors. They are insane. They are unreasonable. They are dangerous. They target civilian nuclear programs, and I think that that has been a success. Yes, I would love it if Iran could keep hammering the Israeli regime without having anyone killed, and with this the whole international community cheering on. But Iran has many calculations, and based on those calculations, it said that okay, now is the time. Netanyahu is begging. Let him now pay the political price at home. So let's see how it plays out inside the regime.
Last night, Iran attacked the US bases in Qatar and Iraq. And what was the main goal of attacking? Just showing the United States that if you attack us again, we're going to attack you? Or you've been sending, Iran was sending some sort of messages to the Arab states in the Gulf region, in the Persian Gulf region, to not participate, to not collaborate if something happens in the future, considering the conflict.
Well, Iraq is complicated, and I don't want to get into Iraq because I haven't really been following it closely, but I think the Israelis have been bombing Iraq yesterday, and they were bombing civilian radar installations and so on because they were claiming that I think that they were assuming that they were helping Iran. I'm not quite sure, so I have to look into that and then get back to Iraq. But in the case of Qatar, the attack, of course, was intended to send a message. Iran could have hit back much harder, but Iran chose not to do so because what Iran wanted to say is that look, the United States we can hit the United States. Trump says, "Don't touch us." Iran touched them, and Trump didn't do anything in return. Some would say, "Well, you should have fired 500 missiles." Yes, maybe we could do that, but the focus is on Israel, and Israel would love to see a war between Iran and the United States because that would ease the burden on the Israeli regime. And if there is a war between Iran and the United States and there's a global economic crisis, then the international community will look at our region differently. We want the focus to be on American aggression. We want it to be focused on Israeli illegitimacy. So Iran hit back at the Americans to send a message, which I think was impressive. You're hitting Israel, the Israeli regime simultaneously as the Americans, and you're also sending a message to these despotic regimes that do nothing for the Palestinians. Qatar is no friend of the Palestinians. Nor is the Emirates. These regimes are in the American camp. Anyone who thinks otherwise is just deceiving themselves. And of course, there are lots of people on the payroll. 21 months, we've seen nothing from any of these countries. The Republic of Azerbaijan in bed with the Israeli regime. Erdogan in bed with the Israeli regime. Qatar, Emirates, Jordan, all of them are in bed with the Israeli regime. There's no doubt about it. So, if people want to direct their anger, they should direct them at those who are in bed with the Israeli regime. I think what Iran did was impressive, but it's in the interest of the Israeli regime for Iran to get into a war with the United States. That's what they want. So why should we do what they want? The Americans don't want it because it would be destructive for them. So why should we, let the Israeli regime get away with it, start a different war? Iran is prepared for a war with the United States. Iran is prepared to take out the Persian Gulf, all its assets. But that's the last case scenario. Your own viewers, if that happens, they will not have jobs. They will not have internet. We will not, the world, our world tomorrow will not be the world that we are living in right now. That's a heavy price to pay for everyone. So if the Israelis want it, then I think people should assume that we should be careful not to do what the Israeli regime wants.
And the outcome of the conflict between Iran and Israel, Iran on one side, Israel and the United States on the other side, how is that going to influence the relationship between Iran and the Arab states?
Well, Iran has been careful not, I when I'm critical, as you know, of all these regimes, but I'm not in government, and that's why I feel free to say these things. And sometimes politicians in Iran or foreign ministry people, they used to come and say, "Why did you say this?" or "Why did you tweet that?" And I said, "Look, I'm not in government." And I think they've come to recognize that there should be, you know, there should be a difference between what someone like myself or others say and what the government says. The government continues to pursue good ties, and Iran will continue to try to cultivate better ties with region with its neighbors. That goes without saying. What I'm saying is to your audience that those who think that Qatar through Al Jazeera is doing a service, Qatar is doing CENTCOM in Qatar is there to protect Israel. That's it. It's for Israel. Who's paying for that base? Qatar is. Qatar is not just given that land. They pay for the US occupation of that land. All of it. So if it costs $500 million a year or whatever the price tag is, Qatar is paying for it, not the United States. This is a huge gift. It's a huge gift to the United States and it's a huge gift to Israel. So, all these countries have American bases. All those bases are basically for the Israeli regime. And but still, Iran as the empire declines and as public opinion is tilting further away from Israel, and as BRICS countries are on the rise, many of these countries in the Persian Gulf may feel pressure to change policies slightly, subtly. They may not. But in any case, Iran wants to use whatever opportunity that is possible to create a wedge between the Israeli regime and whoever else it can in the region and beyond.
We know that Iran was participating in military exercises with Russia and China since 2014. How the way that the United States behaved during this conflict attacked Iran something surprising, something new that wasn't there before. How is that going to influence the Iran's future strategy in terms of because Vladimir Putin in St. Petersburg International Economic Forum said that the Iranians said we don't need any weapon from Russia to come to Iran. And how is that going to change? Is that going to change the attitude on the part of the Iranian government, the way that they see the future and the conflict as time goes by?
Well, I don't want to comment on public comments from Russia. All I can say is that the relationship between Iran, Russia, and China is very good, and that both of them have condemned the Israeli regime, and both of them have excellent relations with Iran, and both of them will continue to have excellent relations with Iran. And I think probably, I think for certain, after what has happened in Gaza and what has happened with the Israeli and American aggression against Iran, the relationship between these countries will move closer. But the military relationship between Iran and Russia exists. I have to check the wording of President Putin. Maybe he's speaking about like some particular date or some particular point in time, like right now. But it's clear that Iran and Russian military ties are they're they're very much uh, uh, an important part of the relationship, and they are ongoing. So, what exactly he meant, we'd have to go and see what his wording is, because he may be saying it in a specific way to be vague. But Iran helps Russia, and Russia helps Iran, and I don't see that is continuing in the future.
Here is what Donald Trump tweeted: Iran will never rebuild their nuclear facilities. How he's so certain about it? Where does it come from, in your opinion?
Iran will never rebuild it.
Yeah.
Well, Trump says something every day. Never, Trump said he was against the war, and the next day he was gloating about supporting the Israelis and being behind it. Nothing that Trump says we should take at face value. He wakes up the morning, says something. He's a serial liar. He's he's dishonest and politically. He's deceitful. He's deceitful. He's deceitful. Uh, so anything that he says really doesn't matter. And if President Putin says something, you have to check the wording. But if Trump says something, you don't even know if he was, what he was up to that morning or what had happened that afternoon. So I wouldn't take that seriously. He said, he spoke about many things when it comes to Iran, and many things when it comes to China, and many things when it comes to Russia and others. But he couldn't achieve them. Iran will continue to develop its nuclear program. The empire is weakening. Israel has faced a severe defeat. Netanyahu, in particular, has suffered a major defeat. Time is on Iran's side, and Iran will continue to take advantage of this fact that time is on its side
Before wrapping up, Professor,
and on the side of the resistance because the world is changing.
one of the main problems with the Israeli attack on Iran was the counterintelligence that Israelis were preparing for this attack for, as you mentioned, for a decade. What is the plan on the part of the Iranian intelligence, Iranian army, Iranian society to go against these sort of activities to not happen in the future?
Well, that is another thing. Just as I said, that Iran is going to deal with its military shortcomings to be able to better uh, deal with any threat by the Israeli regime or the United States in future. The Israelis really, went all out in all of their assets in Iran. Many of them were, of course, Iran has millions of illegal and legal migrants in the country. They have, uh, well, illegal or unregistered, whatever term you'd like to use. But they use a lot of these people, uh, poor people. Some of them have tendencies towards ISIS and Al Qaeda and Takfiri ideology. So they did use a disproportionate number of these sort of people, the Takfiri sort, in the drone attacks and so on. So Iran is going to deal with that, but a lot of the cells have been exposed. A lot of people have been arrested, and I think this is something that the Israeli regime will not be able to do so easily anymore because it's been going all out in using its assets, and one by one they've been discovered, mostly by the public. So this is also something that is not going to go well for the Israeli regime because the Iranians are going to be continue to focus on this issue, decrease its vulnerabilities, both with air defenses but also with terrorists and Israeli assets. And so I think in future, if there is some sort of conflict, Iran will have a stronger hand.
Thank you so much, Professor Marandi, for being with us today. Great pleasure, as always.
Thank you, Nima. Always a pleasure. Always an honor. Have a very good day.
Thank you.